right, so let's take a look at this one. So we have g of x equals -2 cosine of x minus pi over 2. So right now, we can see that we do have a c value, and that is what we are talking about when we're talking about a phase shift. Okay, so I'm going to follow the same kind of process that I always do. I'm going to start out by drawing my shape. So we have a cosine graph, but this time it's negative. It's got a negative a value, so it's vertically reflected. So it's going to start from the minimum instead of the maximum. So I've got my little shape drawn in. My amplitude, remember we're talking about the absolute value of that a value, so it would be 2, right? Amplitude is a distance. It should always be positive. Okay. My period would come from a b value, but I don't have a b value. That would be right here, right? It's just 1. So if my b value is 1, my period doesn't change. It's still 2 pi. But now I do have a phase shift. So I have a phase shift, excuse me, of pi over 2. So my job is to figure out, is that to the left or to the right? And even though it says x minus pi over 2, that actually means that we're shifting to the right, pi over 2. Okay, so that's our phase shift. And then our vertical shift would be a d value, but I noticed there that we don't have one, so a 0 for vertical shift, which means our midline is at y equals 0. My domain has not changed. It's still negative infinity to infinity. And then when I think about my range, if my midline is at 0, I don't have a vertical shift, and I go up 2 and down 2, I'm going to go from -2 to 2. So I've collected all of my information, and I'm going to use this to help me draw it. Now, the only thing is, notice that if we have a phase shift to the right, pi over 2, we want to make sure we give ourselves lots of space. So I'm going to draw this y-axis super far to the left because we're shifting our whole graph to the right by pi over 2. So what that tells me is that at pi over 2 is going to be where my graph is going to begin its new cycle, its first period, okay? So normally our graph starts the cycle on the y-axis, but we are now shifting it over. And we do have a period of 2 pi, so I'm going to take that period of 2 pi and I'm going to divide it into fourths, just like we always do, right? 2 pi over 4 gives me each interval should be pi over 2 long. But I'm starting at pi over 2. This is my first one, right? So my next part is going to be pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which gives me 2 pi over 2, which reduces to pi. Excuse me. Okay, so now I need to find my next interval. I'm going to add pi over 2 again. So now pi plus pi over 2. Okay, well, we might need to make some common denominators here, right? So instead of pi, I can have 2 pi over 2. And that gives me 3 pi over 2. Okay, so I'm getting closer. So now I'm going to take 3 pi over 2. I'm going to add my interval again. So 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 gives me 4 pi over 2, which is going to reduce to be 2 pi. Now, take a look at our graph. Do we have 4 intervals yet? We're starting here. That's 1, 2, 3. No, so we need a 4th interval. We need to keep going. We're going to extend beyond that 2 pi. So we're going to take 2 pi and add that interval again. Now, 2 pi again, it's going to need a common denominator, so I'm going to make that 4 pi over 2 instead of 2 pi. And that gives me 5 pi over 2. Okay. So now I have all 4 intervals, 1, 2, 3, 4. They all have the proper length, which is pi over 2, because that's a fourth of the period. And to figure out what those markers were at, we just kept adding that interval, that pi over 2. So we phase shifted to the right by pi over 2, right? And then we added all of our intervals. Once we do that, now we can continue graphing just like normal. And we can go up 2, down 2, and make sure I draw and copy that shape. So I'm going to start at the minimum. Oh, but wait, look what I did. Out of habit, I started on the y-axis. But we know that's not true. The start of this period has been shifted over pi over 2. So when I start, I'm going to put that in quotes, at the minimum, my start is no longer on the y-axis. It's right here at pi over 2 because we shifted it over, right? So here's pi over 2. That's my minimum. Up to the midline, up to the maximum, back down to the midline, and down to the minimum. And I'm going to draw in as best as I can the shape of my curve. And notice, again, notice when we have that phase shift, we're not, like, quote, starting our period on the y-axis anymore.